Martha Henderson woke up every morning at 6 o'clock, just like she had for the past 40 years. At 93 years old, her body moved slower than it used to, but her mind was still sharp. She would make her coffee, sit on her front porch, and watch the sun come up over her 5 acres of land in Texas. This land was everything to her. She and her husband Robert had bought it in 1982, when it was just empty fields and rolling hills. They built their small ranch house with their own hands, board by board. Robert had passed away 15 years ago, but Martha stayed. This was home. This was where she raised her 3 children. This was where Robert was buried under the big oak tree near the back fence. Martha had 2 horses, Bella and Thunder. Bella was getting old like Martha, but Thunder was still young and full of energy. Every morning after her coffee, Martha would walk to the stable to feed them. Her legs hurt and she had to use a walking stick, but she never missed a day. The horses were her family now. Her children lived far away, busy with their own lives. For many years, Martha's ranch sat alone in the countryside. She could see for miles in every direction. The nearest neighbor was 2 miles down the road. It was quiet and peaceful, just how she liked it. She grew vegetables in her garden, fixed her own fence when it broke, and took care of everything herself. But things started to change about 10 years ago. Construction trucks began showing up in the distance. Day after day, Martha watched as workers cleared the land around her property. Soon, big houses started going up. The builders called it Meadowbrook Estates. They built hundreds of houses, all looking exactly the same. White walls, black roofs, tiny yards with no trees. At first, Martha didn't mind. She thought it might be nice to have neighbors closer by. Maybe she could make some friends. The new families seemed nice enough. Children would sometimes stop by her fence to pet her horses. Martha would give them apples to feed Bella and Thunder. The kids loved it, and it made Martha smile. The problem started about 2 years ago. Martha began getting letters in her mailbox. Official-looking letters with fancy letterhead that said, Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association. Martha didn't know what a homeowners association was. She had never heard of such a thing. The first letter was polite. It welcomed her to the community and explained that there were new rules about how properties should look. Martha was confused. She didn't live in Meadowbrook Estates. She lived on her own land that she owned free and clear. Her property was there long before any of these houses existed. Martha threw the first letter away. She figured it was a mistake. Someone had put the wrong address on the envelope, but more letters kept coming. Each one was less polite than the last. The second letter said her property needed to meet community standards. It listed things that were wrong with her land. Her old red barn was an eyesore. Her horse paddocks were inappropriate structures. Even her vegetable garden was not in keeping with neighborhood appearance. Guidelines. Martha couldn't believe what she was reading. She had been taking care of this property for 40 years. Her barn was old, but it was solid and well-maintained. Her paddocks kept her horses safe and happy. Her garden provided fresh vegetables that she shared with anyone who wanted them. The third letter mentioned money. It said Martha owed violation fees for not following the rules. $50 for the barn, $75 for the paddocks, $25 for the garden. Martha had never heard of such a thing. Why should she pay money to anyone for taking care of her own property? Martha decided to call the phone number on the letter. A woman answered and said she was calling the HOA office. Martha explained that she didn't live in the subdivision. She lived on her own land that was there first. The woman on the phone was not friendly. She said it didn't matter when Martha's property was built. New county rules meant that all properties in the area had to follow HOA guidelines. The woman said if Martha didn't pay the fees and fix the violations, there would be bigger problems. Martha hung up feeling confused and worried. She didn't have much money. Her husband's pension and Social Security barely covered her bills. She couldn't afford to pay fees for things that weren't wrong, and she certainly couldn't afford to tear down her barn or move her horses. More letters came every week. Each one had bigger fees and stronger language. They used words Martha didn't understand, legal words that scared her. The letters talked about liens and foreclosure and legal action. Martha didn't know what these things meant, but they sounded bad. Martha tried calling her oldest son David, but he was deployed overseas with the Navy. Her daughter lived in California with her own family and problems. Her youngest son was struggling to find work and couldn't help with money. Martha felt alone and scared for the first time in years. The letters kept coming. The fees kept growing. Martha's peaceful morning coffee on the porch became a time of worry. Instead of enjoying her horses and her garden, she found herself checking the mailbox with fear. What would the next letter say? How much money would they want now? Martha had survived her husband's death, raised 3 children alone, and kept her ranch running for decades. But these letters from strangers telling her what to do with her own land made her feel helpless. She was 93 years old, and people she had never met were trying to tell her how to live. The last letter she received was the worst one yet. It said she had 30 days to pay over $3,000 in fees or they would take legal action against her property. Martha sat at her kitchen table holding the letter with shaking hands and began to cry. The man who knocked on Martha's door wore an expensive suit and carried a leather folder. He was tall and thin with gray hair and cold blue eyes. He smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile that made Martha feel uncomfortable. "Mrs. Henderson," he said, "my name is Richard Blackwell. I'm the president of the Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association. I believe we need to talk." Martha stood in her doorway, gripping her walking stick tighter. She had lived through enough in her 93 years to know when someone meant trouble. This man meant trouble. "I don't live in your subdivision," Martha said quietly. "This is my land. I've been here for 40 years. Blackwell's fake smile got bigger. "That's exactly what we need to discuss, Mrs. Henderson. May I come in?" Martha didn't want to let him in, but she had been raised to be polite. She stepped aside and let him into her small kitchen. Blackwell looked around with disapproval at her simple furniture and old appliances. He acted like he was better than her, and that made Martha angry. "Mrs. Henderson," Blackwell said as he sat down without being asked, "I'm afraid there's been some confusion. You see, new county regulations have changed things. All properties within a certain distance of established neighborhoods now fall under HOA jurisdiction for community standards." Martha frowned. "What does that mean?" Blackwell opened his folder and pulled out a thick stack of papers. "It means your property must meet the same standards as all the homes in Meadowbrook Estates. And frankly, Mrs. Henderson, your property has numerous violations." He spread photos across Martha's kitchen table. Pictures of her barn, her horse paddocks, her garden, even her old pickup truck. Someone had been on her property taking pictures without her permission. The thought made Martha feel sick. "Your barn is a structural eyesore," Blackwell said, pointing at the photos. "These horse paddocks are inappropriate agricultural structures for a residential area. This vegetable garden violates landscaping guidelines, and this old truck needs to be removed immediately." Martha stared at the photos. These were pictures of her life. Her barn where she kept hay for her horses, the paddocks where Bella and Thunder lived safely, the garden where she grew tomatoes and corn and green beans, the truck that Robert had bought 20 years ago and that still ran perfectly. "There's nothing wrong with any of these things," Martha said. "This is a ranch. This is how people live on ranches." Blackwell shook his head. "Not anymore, Mrs. Henderson. Times have changed. Property values in this area have gone up significantly since Meadowbrook Estates was built. We can't have substandard properties bringing down everyone else's home values." He pulled out another paper. "Here's a list of everything that needs to be fixed or removed. The barn needs to be torn down or completely rebuilt to modern standards. The horse paddocks need to be moved to the back of your property and screened from view. The vegetable garden needs to be replaced with appropriate landscaping. And that truck needs to go." Martha felt her heart beating fast. "I can't afford to do any of that. And I won't do it. This is my home." "I'm afraid you don't have a choice," Blackwell said. His voice was no longer pretending to be friendly. "If these violations aren't corrected within 90 days, you'll face significant fines. $200 per day for the barn, $150 per day for the paddocks, $100 per day for the garden, $50 per day for the truck." Martha tried to do the math in her head. That was $500 every single day. In a month, that would be $15,000. She didn't have that kind of money. She didn't have any extra money at all. "You can't do this," Martha said. "This is my property. I own it free and clear. I don't owe anyone anything." Blackwell stood up and put his papers back in his folder. "Mrs. Henderson, I suggest you consult with a lawyer. You'll find that everything I've told you is completely legal. The county has given our HOA expanded authority to maintain community standards. We're not trying to be difficult. We're just protecting property values for everyone." After he left, Martha sat at her kitchen table for a long time. The photos he had left behind stared up at her. Her life reduced to a list of violations. things that were wrong with the way she lived. Over the next few weeks, the letters came faster. Each one had bigger fines and stronger language. Martha tried calling the county office to ask about these new rules Blackwell had mentioned. She was transferred from office to office. Everyone told her to call someone else. No one seemed to know anything about HOA authority over properties that weren't in subdivisions. Martha tried to call a lawyer, but the first one she contacted wanted $500 just to look at her case. She couldn't afford that. The second lawyer didn't call her back. The third one told her that fighting an HOA was expensive and usually didn't work. The harassment got worse. Blackwell started showing up at her property with other HOA board members. They would walk around taking more pictures and making notes on clipboards. They didn't ask permission. They acted like they owned the place. One morning, Martha found survey stakes driven into her front yard. When she called the HOA office, the same unfriendly woman told her they were documenting property boundaries for enforcement purposes. Martha pulled the stakes out, but they appeared again the next day. The worst part was how the neighbors in Meadowbrook Estates started treating her. At first, some of them had been friendly. They would wave when they drove by. Their children loved seeing her horses, but now they looked at her with suspicion. Some of them stopped and stared at her property, like it was something shameful. Martha learned later that the HOA had sent letters to all the residents warning them about the non-compliant property in their area. The letter suggested that Martha's ranch was hurting their property values. They were told not to interact with her and to report any violations they observed. Children were no longer allowed to pet her horses. Parents would hurry their kids past her fence. People who used to smile and wave now drove by without looking. Martha felt like she had some terrible disease that might spread to others. The isolation was almost worse than the letters and fines. For the first time in her life, Martha felt unwelcome in her own community. She had lived here before any of these people existed, but now she was treated like an outsider who didn't belong. At night, Martha would lie in bed and worry. The stack of threatening letters on her kitchen table grew thicker every day. The fines were now over $8,000. Blackwell had started talking about putting a lien on her property. Martha didn't fully understand what that meant, but she knew it was bad. Her hands shook when she tried to eat. She lost weight because food didn't taste good anymore. Sleep became impossible. Every little sound made her think someone was on her property. The stress was making her sick, but she didn't know what to do. She felt trapped and alone, fighting a battle she didn't understand against people who seemed to have all the power. Martha's peaceful mornings were gone forever. Instead of enjoying her coffee on the porch, she would peek through her curtains to see if anyone was watching her property. More often than not, someone was. Richard Blackwell had started coming by every few days. He would park his black luxury car at the end of her driveway and walk around her property like he owned it. He always carried the same leather folder and a camera with a big lens. He would take pictures of everything, making notes on his clipboard and shaking his head with disapproval. "Mrs. Henderson," he would call out when he saw her, "I'm documenting new violations. That fence post is leaning. Your mailbox doesn't meet community standards. These weeds are over the acceptable height limit." Martha tried to stay inside when he came, but Blackwell would knock on her door. When she didn't answer, he would walk around the house, taking pictures of her windows, her roof, her small back porch. He acted like he had every right to be there. The other HOA board members started coming with him. 3 or 4 people in expensive clothes, all carrying clipboards and cameras. They would spread out across her property, measuring things and writing everything down. They talked about Martha like she wasn't there, using words like eyesore and blight and property damage. Martha felt like a prisoner in her own home. She stopped going outside during the day except to feed her horses. Even that became difficult because the HOA people would follow her to the stable, taking pictures of everything she did. They made her feel like she was doing something wrong by caring for her animals. The worst part was when they brought a security guard. His name was Jake, and he was a big man who wore all black clothes and dark sunglasses. Blackwell hired him to monitor the situation, which meant he would park at the end of Martha's driveway for hours at a time. Jake never got out of his car, but Martha could feel him watching her. When she looked out her window, he was always there, sitting in his white SUV like a predator waiting for its prey. The car had Meadowbrook Estates Security written on the side in big letters, as if Martha was some kind of criminal who needed to be watched. Martha's neighbor from down the road, Mrs. Garcia, tried to visit one day. She brought Martha some homemade bread like she had done for years. But when she turned into the driveway, Jake got out of his car and walked over to her. "Ma'am, you can't go up there," he told Mrs. Garcia. "This is a restricted property under HOA investigation." Mrs. Garcia was confused. "I'm just visiting my friend. I've been coming here for 10 years. Sorry, ma'am. No visitors allowed during the enforcement period." Martha watched from her window as Mrs. Garcia drove away, looking confused and hurt. Later that day, Martha tried to call her to explain, but Mrs. Garcia said she didn't want to get involved in any trouble with the HOA. She stopped visiting after that. The isolation became complete. Martha's only human contact was with people who wanted to hurt her. The postal worker started looking at her with pity when he delivered the daily stack of threatening letters. The grocery delivery boy seemed scared when he brought her food, like he might catch whatever disease had made her a target. Martha's health began to fail. She lost 15 pounds in 2 months because food had no taste. Everything she ate felt like cardboard. Her hands shook constantly now, not just when she was nervous. She had trouble sleeping because every little noise made her think someone was on her property. The chest pains started on a Tuesday morning, sharp, stabbing pains that made her gasp and grab the kitchen counter. Martha knew what heart problems felt like. Robert had died from a heart attack, but she was too scared to go to the hospital and leave her property unguarded. What if they did something to her horses while she was gone? The legal papers arrived on a Thursday. A sheriff's deputy brought them to her door and made her sign for them. The papers were full of words Martha didn't understand, but she understood enough to know she was in serious trouble. The HOA was putting a lien on her property for unpaid fines that now totaled over $12,000. "What does this mean?" Martha asked the deputy. The man looked uncomfortable. "Ma'am, I'm not allowed to give legal advice, but you might want to call a lawyer." Martha had already tried calling lawyers. The ones who would talk to her all said the same thing. Fighting an HOA was expensive and difficult. Most people just gave in and did what the HOA wanted. But Martha couldn't afford to do what they wanted, and she wouldn't destroy the life she and Robert had built together. Blackwell's visits became more aggressive. He would arrive with measuring tape and check every inch of her property. He found new violations every time. Her garden hose was stored improperly. Her horse water trough was the wrong color. The path from her house to the barn wasn't approved hardscape material. "Mrs. Henderson," he said during one visit, "you're making this much harder than it needs to be. We're prepared to be reasonable. Sell your property to our development company, and we'll waive all the fines. You could move to a nice senior living facility and not have to worry about maintaining all this land." Martha's anger finally overcame her fear. "This is my home. Robert and I built this with our own hands. He's buried here. I'll never sell to you." Blackwell's fake politeness disappeared. "Then you'll lose it anyway, Mrs. Henderson. We'll foreclose on the lien. The property will be sold at auction, and we'll buy it for the amount you owe us. Either way, you're going to lose your home. The only question is whether you get any money out of it." That night, Martha sat at her kitchen table looking at all the legal papers. The foreclosure notice gave her 30 days to pay the full amount or lose her property. $12,000 plus legal fees and interest. Money she didn't have and couldn't get. For the first time since Robert died, Martha felt completely defeated. She was 93 years old, sick, alone, and fighting people who had more money and power than she could imagine. They had lawyers and security guards and official papers. She had nothing but a stubborn refusal to give up the only thing that mattered to her. Martha walked out to the stable that night and fed Bella and Thunder. The old mare nuzzled her hand gently, sensing something was wrong. Thunder, usually full of energy, stood quietly beside his companion. "I don't know what's going to happen to us," Martha whispered to her horses, "but I promise I'll fight for you as long as I can." The stars were bright that night, the same stars she and Robert used to watch from their porch 40 years ago. But everything else had changed. Her peaceful ranch had become a battlefield, and Martha was losing the war. She went inside and sat by her phone for a long time. Her son David was somewhere overseas, fighting real battles in dangerous places. She had never wanted to burden him with her problems. But Martha was out of options. She needed help, and David was the only person in the world who might be able to give it to her. With shaking fingers, Martha dialed the emergency contact number David had given her years ago. A recorded voice told her to leave a message and it would be forwarded to her son when possible. "David," she said, her voice breaking. "It's Mom. I need you to call me when you can. Some people are trying to take our home away and I don't know what to do anymore." Martha had always been proud of her independence. Even after Robert died, even as she got older and slower, she had taken care of everything herself. She fixed her own fence, maintained her truck, and solved her own problems. That's how she had raised her children, especially David. Be strong, be independent, handle your own troubles. David was her middle child, but he had always been different from his brother and sister. Where they were gentle and quiet like their father, David had fire in him. As a little boy, he would fight kids twice his size if they picked on someone smaller. He never started fights, but he always finished them. When David graduated high school, Martha wasn't surprised when he said he wanted to join the Navy. She was proud but worried. The world was a dangerous place, and she knew her son would always volunteer for the most dangerous jobs. That's just who he was. David had been a Navy SEAL for 15 years now. Martha didn't fully understand what he did, but she knew it was important and secret and dangerous. He couldn't talk about his missions when he called home. Sometimes months would go by without any contact at all. Martha would lie awake at night wondering if her son was safe, if he was even still alive. She had David's emergency contact number written on a piece of paper taped to her refrigerator. He had given it to her years ago and told her to only use it for real emergencies. "Mom," he had said, "this goes directly to my commanding officer. They can find me anywhere in the world if something happens to you, but only use it if you really need me." Martha had never used the number. When she had her gallbladder surgery 3 years ago, she didn't call. When she fell and broke her wrist, she didn't call. When the tornado damaged her barn roof, she didn't call. David was fighting for his country, and Martha didn't want to distract him with her problems. But sitting in her kitchen at midnight, surrounded by foreclosure papers and threatening letters, Martha finally admitted she couldn't handle this alone. The HOA was going to take her home in 30 days. Everything she and Robert had built together would be gone. She would lose the land where she had raised her children, where Robert was buried, where she had planned to spend her final years. The emergency message system was automated. A computer voice told her to state her name, relationship to the service member, and the nature of the emergency. Then it asked her to leave a detailed message. Martha's voice shook as she spoke. "This is Martha Henderson, mother of Petty Officer David Henderson. I need my son to call me as soon as possible. Some people are trying to take our home away and I don't know what else to do. David, if you get this message, please call me. I'm sorry to bother you, but I'm scared." She hung up and immediately felt guilty. David was probably in some dangerous place, focused on staying alive and completing his mission. Now he would be worried about her when he needed to concentrate on his own safety. The phone rang 6 hours later. Martha had been dozing in her chair, too anxious to go to bed. The sound made her jump and she grabbed the receiver before the second ring. "Mom?" David's voice sounded far away and fuzzy, but hearing it made Martha start crying. "David, oh honey, I'm so sorry to call you. I know you're busy, but I didn't know who else to—" "Mom, slow down. Take a breath. Tell me what's happening." Martha tried to explain everything. The HOA, the letters, the fines, the threats to take her property. But the words came out jumbled and confused. She kept starting over, trying to make David understand how people she had never met were destroying her life. "Okay, Mom. Let me make sure I understand this," David said when she finally stopped talking. "Some homeowners association is claiming they have authority over your property, even though you don't live in their subdivision. That's what they say. This man, Richard Blackwell, he says new county rules give them power over all properties in the area. But David, I was here first, 40 years before any of these houses existed." Martha could hear David talking to someone else, but she couldn't make out the words. When he came back on the line, his voice was different, harder. "Mom, listen to me carefully. Do not sign anything. Do not pay any money, and do not let anyone on your property without a search warrant signed by a real judge. Do you understand?" "Yes, but David, they say they're going to foreclose. They want $12,000 and I don't have that kind of money. They can't foreclose on a fraudulent lien, Mom. And that's what this sounds like. I'm coming home." Martha felt a mix of relief and guilt. "No, honey, you don't need to do that. You have important work." "Nothing is more important than protecting my family," David said firmly. "I'm requesting emergency leave right now. I'll be on the first flight I can catch. But what about your mission? David was quiet for a moment. Mom, you raised me to stand up to bullies, remember? That's all this is. A bunch of bullies picking on someone they think can't fight back. They picked the wrong family. After Martha hung up, she felt better than she had in months. Help was coming. David would know what to do. He had always been the problem solver in the family, the one who stepped in when things got bad. But as the hours passed, Martha's worry returned. What if she had made a mistake calling him? What if she had pulled her son away from something crucial for nothing? What if the HOA really did have the legal right to do what they were doing? The next morning, Jake the security guard was back in his usual spot at the end of her driveway. Martha watched him from her window and wondered what he would think when David arrived. The guard was used to intimidating a 93-year-old woman living alone. David was different. David was dangerous. Blackwell showed up around noon with 2 other HOA board members. They walked around her property like they always did, taking pictures and making notes. But this time Martha didn't hide inside. She went out to meet them. "Mr. Blackwell," she called out, her voice stronger than it had been in weeks. He looked up from his clipboard with his usual fake smile. "Mrs. Henderson, I hope you've reconsidered our generous offer. Time is running out." "My son is coming home," Martha said. Blackwell's smile flickered for just a moment. "That's nice, Mrs. Henderson, but family visits won't change your legal situation. You still owe—" "My son is a Navy SEAL," Martha interrupted. The other HOA members looked at each other nervously. Blackwell tried to maintain his confidence, but Martha could see uncertainty in his eyes. "Mrs. Henderson, I'm sure your son is a fine young man, but military service doesn't exempt you from local property regulations." "We'll see about that," Martha said, and walked back into her house. For the first time in months, Martha felt like herself again. She wasn't just a helpless old woman anymore. She was David's mother, and David was coming home. The people who had been tormenting her were about to learn that some families don't give up without a fight. That afternoon, Martha called her neighbor Mrs. Garcia and apologized for the trouble the HOA had caused. She called the few friends she had left and told them David was coming home on leave. She even managed to eat a full meal for the first time in weeks. As the sun set over her 5 acres of Texas land, Martha sat on her front porch with her coffee, just like she used to do. Jake was still parked at the end of her driveway, but Martha wasn't afraid of him anymore. In fact, she almost felt sorry for him. He had no idea what was coming his way. David's plane landed in Dallas at 6 in the morning. He had been traveling for 36 hours straight, catching military transport flights from a classified location in the Middle East to Germany, then to the East Coast, and finally to Texas. He hadn't slept, hadn't shaved, and was running on nothing but black coffee and anger. The rental car drive to his mother's ranch took 2 hours. David used the time to make phone calls to old contacts who now worked in law enforcement and local government. He needed to understand exactly what his mother was facing before he walked into the situation. What he learned made his jaw clench with controlled fury. The Meadowbrook Estates HOA had no legal authority over properties outside their subdivision boundaries. The new county regulations Blackwell had cited didn't exist. This was a systematic harassment campaign designed to force property acquisition through manufactured legal pressure. As David turned down the familiar dirt road that led to his childhood home, he saw the white security SUV parked at the end of the driveway. Jake was sitting inside, probably half asleep after months of boring surveillance duty. David parked his rental car behind the SUV and walked up to the driver's window. Jake looked up, startled by the tap on his glass. He saw a man in civilian clothes who clearly hadn't slept in days, but there was something in David's eyes that made the security guard immediately alert. Jake rolled down his window halfway. "Can I help you?" Jake asked, trying to sound official. "You're on my mother's property," David said quietly. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that made Jake unconsciously lean away from the window. "This is public road access for HOA enforcement activities," Jake replied. But his voice wasn't as confident as his words. David smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. "No, it's not. This is a private driveway on private property that predates your subdivision by 40 years. You're trespassing." Jake reached for his radio, but David's hand was suddenly on his wrist. The grip was firm but not painful, just strong enough to make it clear that David could crush his wrist if he wanted to. "I'm going to give you 30 seconds to leave," David said, If I see you here again, we're going to have a different kind of conversation. Jake looked into David's eyes and saw something that made him very nervous. This wasn't like dealing with a scared old woman. This was someone who had done violence and would do it again if necessary. Jake started his engine. The HOA will hear about this, Jake said as he put the car in drive. I'm counting on it, David replied. David walked up the long driveway to the small ranch house where he had grown up. Everything looked smaller than he remembered, but it was still home. The old oak tree where he used to build forts. The stable where he had learned to ride. The porch where his mother used to sit and wait for him to come home from school. Martha opened the door before he could knock. She looked older and frailer than when he had seen her 2 years ago. She had lost weight and there were dark circles under her eyes. But when she saw her son, her face lit up with relief and joy. David, she said, and collapsed into his arms. David held his mother and felt his anger grow stronger. The woman who had raised him to be strong and independent had been reduced to this by a bunch of bureaucratic bullies. They had made her afraid in her own home, stressed her into losing weight, and threatened to take away everything she cared about. I'm here now, Mom, he said. Everything's going to be okay. Martha made coffee and sat across from her son at the same kitchen table where she had helped him with homework 30 years ago. She showed him the stack of threatening letters, the foreclosure papers, and the list of bogus violations. David read through everything with the methodical attention to detail that had kept him alive through a dozen dangerous missions. Mom, this is all garbage, he said finally. They don't have any legal authority over your property. These fines are worthless. The foreclosure threat is fraud. But they seem so official, Martha said. They have lawyers and legal papers and they have letterhead and intimidation tactics, David interrupted. It's psychological warfare designed to make you give up without fighting. Classic bully behavior. David spent the rest of the day walking around the property with his mother. She showed him where Blackwell and his people had been taking pictures, where they had driven survey stakes, where the security guard had been parking. David noted everything, building a picture of the harassment campaign in his mind. They come by almost every day now, Martha said as they stood by the horse paddock. That man Blackwell acts like he owns the place. David was quiet for a long moment, watching Bella and Thunder graze peacefully in the afternoon sun. These were good horses, well cared for and content. The paddock was well maintained and safe. There was absolutely nothing wrong with any of it. When do they usually show up? He asked. Around 10 in the morning, usually. Sometimes earlier. Good, I want to meet them. That evening, David made more phone calls. He contacted the county clerk's office to get copies of all property records. He called the county attorney's office to file a complaint about HOA harassment. He reached out to a lawyer friend who specialized in property rights cases. Most importantly, he called his old team leader who now worked for the FBI. David explained the situation and asked for a background check on Richard Blackwell and the other HOA board members. If they were running a property scam on his mother, they were probably running it on other people too. I'll have information for you in 24 hours, his friend said. But Dave, be careful. Don't do anything that could get you in legal trouble. I'm not planning to hurt anyone, David replied. I'm just going to have a conversation. Martha slept better that night than she had in months. For the first time since the harassment began, she felt safe in her own home. David was in his old room down the hall, and she knew that nothing bad could happen with her son there to protect her. David didn't sleep much. He spent the night going through all the legal documents, researching property law, and planning his approach. By morning, he had a complete understanding of the situation and a strategy for ending it. At 9:30 the next morning, David was sitting on the front porch with a cup of coffee when Blackwell's black car turned into the driveway. David had changed into clean clothes and shaved, but he still looked like what he was, a professional warrior who had been pushed too far. Blackwell got out of his car with his usual leather folder and camera. He had brought 2 other HOA board members with him, just like always. But this time, instead of an elderly woman watching fearfully from behind curtains, there was a man sitting calmly on the porch steps. David stood up as they approached. He was 6 feet tall and built like someone who stayed in fighting shape for a living. His posture was relaxed but alert, the way a predator looks when it's deciding whether something is worth hunting. Good morning, David said politely. You must be Richard Blackwell. Blackwell stopped walking. Something in the younger man's voice and bearing made him suddenly nervous. Yes, and you are? David Henderson, Martha's son. David's smile was friendly, but his eyes were cold. I understand you've been harassing my mother. The two other HOA members took a step backward. Blackwell tried to maintain his usual arrogant confidence, but faced with Martha's son, he suddenly felt less sure of himself. We're simply enforcing community standards. Mr. Henderson, your mother's property has numerous violations that need to be addressed. No, David said quietly. You're running a fraud scheme designed to steal property from elderly people who can't fight back. But you made one mistake, Mr. Blackwell. What's that? Blackwell asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know. David's smile got wider, but it didn't reach his eyes. You picked the wrong family. After Blackwell and his people left that morning, David went into full mission planning mode. He had spent 15 years as a Navy SEAL, and one thing that job had taught him was the importance of intelligence gathering before any operation. You don't go into a fight until you know everything about your enemy. David set up his laptop on his mother's kitchen table and started researching. He began with public records, using skills he had learned in military intelligence training. Property ownership records, business licenses, court filings, tax information. Within 2 hours, he had a complete picture of Richard Blackwell's background. What he found confirmed his suspicions. Blackwell had been a real estate developer who went bankrupt 5 years ago after several failed projects. He lost his construction company, his office building, and most of his personal wealth. The HOA presidency wasn't just about power for Blackwell, it was about money. David dug deeper. Blackwell had formed a property management company right after becoming HOA president. That company had contracts to manage several properties that had been acquired through HOA foreclosure actions. In other words, Blackwell was using his position to force property sales, then profiting from managing those same properties. The pattern was clear and probably criminal. Find elderly or vulnerable property owners near the subdivision, claim HOA authority where none existed, harass them with fake violations and impossible fines, force them to sell or lose their property through fraudulent foreclosure. Then step in to manage the property for the new owners. David's friend at the FBI called back that afternoon with more information. Your guy Blackwell is already on our radar, he said. We've had complaints about similar schemes in 3 other counties, but we haven't been able to make a case yet because most of the victims just gave up and moved away. What do you need to make a case? David asked. Evidence of the harassment, proof that the HOA claims are fraudulent, and victims willing to testify. The problem is most elderly people are too scared or embarrassed to go through a court process. David smiled grimly. Well, you've got one victim who isn't going anywhere, and her son who knows how to gather evidence. Over the next 3 days, David conducted surveillance on Blackwell and the other HOA board members. He used techniques learned in special operations, following them at a distance, photographing their activities, and documenting their daily routines. What he discovered was even worse than he had expected. Blackwell wasn't just targeting Martha. David identified 4 other elderly property owners who were being harassed with similar tactics. Mrs. Chen, an 80-year-old widow whose small farm bordered the subdivision. Mr. Rodriguez, a 75-year-old retiree whose workshop apparently violated noise ordinances. Mrs. Patterson, whose flower gardens were deemed agricultural use in a residential zone. David visited each of them, introducing himself as someone fighting the same battle his mother was facing. The stories were all the same. Threatening letters, impossible fines, harassment, and intimidation. None of them could afford lawyers. All of them felt helpless and alone. They told me I had to tear down my workshop or pay $15,000 in fines, Mr. Rodriguez explained. His hands shook as he showed David the letters. I built furniture in there for 40 years. Now they say it's a commercial operation that's not allowed. Mrs. Chen was in the worst situation. The HOA was claiming her vegetable stand violated commercial zoning laws and demanding $50,000 in back fines. They want me to sell to their development company for half what my property is worth, she said through tears. If I don't, they'll take it anyway. David documented everything. He photographed the properties, copied the threatening letters, and recorded statements from each victim. He also used his military contacts to research the legal standing of every claim the HOA had made. Not one of them had any basis in actual law. The breakthrough came when David decided to attend an HOA board meeting. The meetings were supposedly open to the public, though they were only advertised in the subdivision newsletter. David arrived early and sat in the back of the community center conference room. Blackwell was clearly surprised to see him there. The other board members, two middle-aged women and an elderly man, looked nervous when Blackwell whispered something to them about the Henderson situation. David listened as they discussed their ongoing enforcement actions. They used coded language, but their meaning was clear. They were coordinating harassment campaigns against multiple property owners, sharing strategies for maximum intimidation, and planning the acquisition of non-compliant properties through foreclosure. Most importantly, David heard them discuss their arrangement with a construction company that wanted to buy the acquired properties for development. The whole scheme wasn't just about HOA power. It was about forcing property sales to benefit specific developers. David recorded the entire meeting on his phone. In Texas, it was legal to record public meetings, and the HOA board was discussing what amounted to conspiracy to commit fraud. The recording would be valuable evidence for law enforcement. After the meeting, David followed Blackwell to a restaurant where he met with two men in expensive suits. David couldn't get close enough to hear the conversation, but he photographed the license plates and later identified the men as executives from a development company that specialized in senior living facilities. The picture was now complete. Blackwell and his associates were systematically targeting elderly property owners, using fraudulent HOA authority to force property sales, then selling the land to developers who would build profitable senior housing projects. It was organized, methodical, and completely illegal. David spent one more day gathering evidence before moving to the next phase of his plan. He contacted the county district attorney's office and arranged a meeting with a prosecutor who handled fraud cases. He reached out to local news stations that had covered similar HOA abuse stories. He also called a lawyer who specialized in civil rights violations and property law. Most importantly, he organized the other victims. David brought Mrs. Chen, Mr. Rodriguez, Mrs. Patterson, and two other affected property owners together at his mother's house. For the first time, they realized they weren't alone in their fight. "They're counting on us being too scared and isolated to fight back," David told the group. "But there are 6 of us now, and we have evidence of everything they've done. They picked fights with the wrong people." Martha looked around her kitchen at her neighbors, many of whom she had known for years. These were good people who had worked hard their whole lives and deserved to enjoy their golden years in peace. Instead, they had been terrorized by greedy bullies who saw them as easy targets. "What do we do now?" Mrs. Chen asked. David smiled, and this time it was a genuine smile full of confidence and determination. "Now we go on the offensive. It's time to remind Mr. Blackwell and his friends that some battles have consequences." That evening, David called his mother to the porch and showed her everything he had discovered. The evidence files, the recordings, the photographs, the legal research. Martha had raised a son who never backed down from a fight, and now she could see that her son had turned into a formidable adversary. "Are you going to be able to stop them?" she asked. David put his arm around his mother's shoulders and looked out over the land where he had grown up. The same land that bullies were trying to steal from the woman who had sacrificed everything to raise him. "Mom, they have no idea what they've gotten themselves into," he said, "but they're about to find out." The monthly HOA board meeting was usually a quiet affair with maybe 10 residents in attendance. But word had spread through Meadowbrook Estates that something big was going to happen. By 7 o'clock, the community center was packed with over 100 people. Residents filled every chair and lined the walls, whispering nervously about rumors they had heard. David arrived at exactly 7:15, wearing his navy dress blue uniform. The dark blue jacket with gold buttons, white shirt, and ribbon rack displaying his service medals created an immediate stir in the room. People who had never paid attention to military decorations could still recognize that this man had done extraordinary things in dangerous places. Martha walked beside her son, wearing her best dress and holding her head high for the first time in months. Behind them came Mrs. Chen, Mr. Rodriguez, Mrs. Patterson, and the other property owners who had been targeted by the HOA's harassment campaign. They had all dressed formally for what they knew would be an important evening. Blackwell was sitting at the head table with the other board members, shuffling through papers and trying to look important. When he saw David enter in uniform, his face went pale. The confident, arrogant man who had terrorized elderly property owners suddenly looked very small and nervous. David guided his mother to a seat in the front row, then walked to the back of the room where he could see everything. He stood at attention with his hands clasped behind his back, a posture that radiated controlled power. Every person in the room could feel his presence, and conversations gradually died down to whispers. Blackwell called the meeting to order, but his usual commanding voice cracked slightly. He tried to follow the normal agenda, discussing routine subdivision business like landscaping contracts and budget reports. But everyone in the room was watching David, waiting for something to happen. "Is there any new business?" Blackwell finally asked, though he clearly didn't want to hear the answer. David stepped forward. "Yes, Mr. Blackwell. I have some things to discuss with you and the board." The room was completely silent now. David walked slowly to the front, his military bearing making him seem larger and more imposing than his actual size. When he reached the podium usually reserved for residents making brief comments, he turned to face the board. "My name is Petty Officer David Henderson, United States Navy SEALs. I'm here tonight to discuss the criminal harassment campaign this board has been conducting against my mother and other property owners in this community." Blackwell tried to interrupt. "Mr. Henderson, this is not the proper forum for—" "You'll have your chance to talk," David said quietly, but his voice carried enough authority to make Blackwell shut his mouth immediately. "Right now you're going to listen." David opened a folder he had brought with him. "For the past 6 months, you and your associates have been systematically targeting elderly property owners with fraudulent violation notices, illegal fines, and harassment tactics designed to force property sales. You've claimed HOA authority that doesn't exist, cited county regulations that were never passed, and threatened foreclosure actions based on liens that have no legal foundation." The crowd began murmuring. Many residents had heard rumors about HOA problems with outside properties, but most hadn't understood the scope of what was happening. David pulled out photographs and documents, holding them up for everyone to see. "This is evidence of your people trespassing on private property to take unauthorized photographs. This is documentation of your security guard intimidating elderly residents. This is a recording of your last board meeting where you discussed coordination with developers who want to buy foreclosed properties." Blackwell was sweating now. The other board members looked confused and frightened. The elderly man who served as treasurer was staring at David with growing horror, clearly realizing the legal implications of what they had been doing. "You targeted my 83-year-old mother because you thought she was helpless," David continued, his voice getting harder. "You sent armed security guards to intimidate her. You threatened to take away the home where she's lived for 40 years, the land where my father is buried. You made her afraid to step outside her own house." Martha was crying quietly, but they were tears of pride and relief, not fear. Her son was fighting for her the way she had always fought for him when he was young. David's voice rose slightly, carrying to every corner of the packed room. "What you didn't count on is that some families don't abandon their elderly members to be victimized by predators. What you didn't consider is that some people have been trained to deal with bullies who prey on the innocent." He stepped closer to the board table, and Blackwell actually leaned back in his chair. David's ribbon rack included decorations that military people in the audience recognized. Bronze Star with V device, Purple Heart, Navy Cross. This was not someone who backed down from fights. "I've spent the last week investigating your operation," David said. "I've documented harassment of at least 6 property owners. I've recorded evidence of conspiracy to commit fraud. I've identified your financial arrangements with development companies. And I've shared all of this evidence with the county district attorney, the FBI, and several news organizations." The room erupted in shocked whispers. Board members were looking at each other with panic in their eyes. Blackwell tried one more time to regain control. "This is all very dramatic, Mr. Henderson, but you can't just come in here and make wild accusations." David pulled out his phone and played the recording of the previous board meeting. Blackwell's voice filled the room, discussing enforcement actions and property acquisition opportunities with his fellow board members. The context made their criminal intent unmistakable. When the recording ended, the room was dead silent again. David put his phone away and looked directly at Blackwell. "Here's what's going to happen," he said. "You're going to immediately drop all claims against my mother's property and every other property you've been targeting. You're going to publicly apologize for your harassment campaign. You're going to reimburse every penny of legal fees and costs your victims have incurred, and then you're going to resign from this board and hope that criminal prosecutors decide to be lenient with you. Blackwell's face had gone from pale to red to pale again. You can't dictate terms to this board. We have legal authority. No, David interrupted. You don't, you never did. You've been running a criminal enterprise and it ends tonight. David turned to address the crowd of residents. Many of you have been told that properties like my mother's hurt your home values. That's not true. What hurts property values is living in a community run by criminals who use harassment and intimidation tactics against their neighbors. What hurts property values is being associated with fraud and corruption. He gestured toward Martha and the other elderly victims in the front row. These people were here first. They built their homes and raised their families on this land before your subdivision existed. They deserve respect, not harassment. They deserve to live in peace, not in fear of bureaucratic bullies. The crowd began applauding. It started with a few people and quickly spread through the room. Residents who had been uncomfortable with the HOA's aggressive tactics finally had permission to express their disapproval. The applause grew louder and lasted for over a minute. When it finally died down, David looked back at Blackwell. You have 24 hours to drop all claims and issue public apologies. If you don't, everything I've documented goes to the news media tomorrow morning. I promise you, Mr. Blackwell, that you don't want your story told on the evening news. David collected his papers and walked back to his mother. He helped her to her feet and escorted her toward the exit, followed by the other property owners and dozens of supportive residents. As they reached the door, David turned around one last time. Oh, and Mr. Blackwell, if any of you ever harass my mother or her neighbors again, we'll have a very different kind of conversation, one you won't enjoy nearly as much as this one. The meeting dissolved into chaos as David and his group left. Board members were arguing, residents were demanding answers, and Blackwell was sitting frozen in his chair, finally understanding that he had picked a fight with the wrong family. Outside in the parking lot, Martha hugged her son tightly. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered. David hugged her back, thinking about all the times she had protected him when he was young, all the sacrifices she had made to raise him right. "I learned from the best, Mom," he said. "Nobody messes with my family." The next morning, Martha woke up to the sound of her phone ringing. It was barely 7 o'clock, but she felt more rested than she had in months. For the first time since the harassment began, she had slept through the entire night without waking up worried about what new threat might be waiting in her mailbox. "Mrs. Henderson?" The voice on the phone was nervous and formal. "This is Janet Williams from the Meadowbrook Estates HOA board. I'm calling to inform you that all claims against your property have been dropped, effective immediately." Martha sat down at her kitchen table, hardly believing what she was hearing. "All of them?" "Yes, ma'am. All fines, all violation notices, all legal actions." The board voted unanimously in an emergency session at 6 this morning. You should receive written confirmation by mail today, along with a formal apology letter. After Martha hung up, she walked to the window and looked out at her property. The morning sun was shining on her old red barn, her horse paddocks, and her vegetable garden. Everything looked exactly the same as it had for 40 years, but somehow it felt different now. It felt safe again. David came out of his old bedroom already dressed and drinking coffee. He had been up since 5, monitoring news coverage and coordinating with law enforcement officials. "Good news, Mom?" Martha smiled. "They dropped everything. All the fines, all the claims. It's over." David hugged his mother. "I told you it would be. Bullies always back down when someone stands up to them." The formal apology letter arrived that afternoon, delivered by certified mail, along with legal documents officially withdrawing all HOA claims. The letter was signed by the entire board and specifically apologized for overstepping legal boundaries and causing unnecessary distress to valued community members. But the real vindication came that evening on the local news. Channel 8 had picked up the story after receiving David's evidence package, and their investigation had uncovered even more victims of the HOA's harassment scheme. Tonight at 6, we expose a local homeowners association that allegedly targeted elderly residents with fraudulent fines and illegal harassment, the news anchor announced. Our investigation reveals a pattern of abuse that may have been part of an organized property acquisition scheme. The news story was devastating for Blackwell and his associates. Hidden camera footage showed him making threatening statements to elderly property owners. Financial records revealed his connections to development companies, that had profited from forced property sales. Former HOA board members came forward to describe pressure tactics they had been uncomfortable with, but afraid to oppose. By the end of the week, Richard Blackwell had resigned from the HOA board in disgrace. The other board members who had participated in the harassment campaign also stepped down. The county district attorney announced a formal investigation into possible criminal fraud charges. Mrs. Chen called Martha that weekend to share her own good news. "They dropped all the claims against my farm, too," she said happily. "And that nice lawyer your son recommended says I might be able to sue them for damages." Mr. Rodriguez had similar news. The demands to tear down his workshop had been withdrawn, along with $15,000 in accumulated fines. "I'm going back to making furniture," he told Martha. "First thing I'm going to build is a rocking chair for your front porch." The story spread beyond the local area when military news websites picked it up. Navy SEAL defends mother from HOA harassment became a viral story, shared thousands of times on social media. Veterans groups and military families saw it as a perfect example of the values they fought to protect. David received messages of support from SEALs and other military personnel around the world. Many shared their own stories of family members being targeted by various scams and harassment campaigns while they were deployed overseas. The story resonated with anyone who understood the sacrifice military families make. "You did the right thing, brother," one message read. "Taking care of family is what we're all fighting for." A week later, David had to report back to his unit, but he wasn't worried about leaving his mother anymore. The harassment campaign was over, the legal threats had been withdrawn, and the people responsible were facing serious consequences for their actions. Martha's health improved dramatically once the stress was gone. She gained back the weight she had lost, her hands stopped shaking, and the chest pains disappeared completely. She started spending her mornings on the front porch again, drinking coffee and watching her horses graze in the peaceful morning light. The neighbors in Meadowbrook Estates were friendlier now, too. Children were allowed to visit the horses again. Parents would stop by to thank Martha for standing up to the corrupt HOA leadership. Some even brought vegetables from their own gardens to trade for the tomatoes and peppers Martha grew. "I'm sorry we weren't more supportive during your troubles," one neighbor told her. "We knew something wasn't right, but we were afraid to speak up." Martha understood. Fear made people do things they weren't proud of. But she also learned that courage was contagious. When one person stood up to bullies, it gave others permission to do the same. The new HOA board was completely different from the old one. They focused on actual community issues like road maintenance and neighborhood safety, not on harassing people who lived outside their jurisdiction. They even passed a resolution officially recognizing the historical importance of properties that predated the subdivision. 6 months later, Martha received an unexpected visitor. A documentary filmmaker had heard about the story and wanted to interview her for a project about HOA abuse across the country. Martha wasn't sure she wanted to be on camera, but David encouraged her to share her experience. "Other people need to hear this story, Mom," he told her during one of their regular phone calls. "There are elderly people all over the country facing the same kind of harassment you went through. Your story might help them realize they don't have to give up." Martha agreed to the interview. Sitting in her living room with the filmmaker's cameras rolling, she spoke clearly and confidently about her ordeal and her son's heroic intervention. "I raised my son to stand up for what's right," she said, "but I never imagined he would have to come home from serving his country to protect his own mother from bullies in his hometown. David saved our home, but more importantly, he reminded everyone that family means never abandoning the people you love." The documentary aired on a national cable channel 6 months later. It featured Martha's story along with similar cases from around the country, exposing a pattern of HOA abuse that targeted vulnerable property owners. The film led to new legislation in several states providing better protection for elderly residents facing harassment campaigns. David watched the documentary from his base overseas, proud of his mother's courage in sharing her story with the world. She had gone from victim to advocate, helping other families avoid the trauma she had experienced. As Martha celebrated her 94th birthday surrounded by friends and neighbors, she reflected on the difficult year that had brought out both the worst and best in people. The harassment had been terrible, but it had also shown her how much love and support existed in her community. Most importantly, it had reminded her that the values she had tried to teach her children, courage, loyalty, and protecting those who couldn't protect themselves, had taken root and grown strong. David was still serving his country overseas, but he would always be ready to come home and fight for his family. Martha's ranch remained her sanctuary, now legally protected and surrounded by people who respected both her property rights and her son's service. Every morning, she sat on her front porch with her coffee, watching the sun rise over land that would always be home. The old red barn still stood strong against the Texas sky. Thunder and Bella still grazed peacefully in their paddocks, and Martha's vegetable garden still provided fresh produce that she shared with anyone who needed it. Some battles end with victory, others with compromise. But this battle had ended the way David had promised it would, with justice for the innocent and consequences for those who preyed on the vulnerable. It was exactly the kind of ending Robert would have been proud of, and exactly the kind of son Martha had raised David to be.